So what do we mean by modern JavaScript? The idea with modern JavaScript is that it's anything in the JavaScript language that was released on and after 2015, which is the version of JavaScript known as ES6 or ES 2015. So everything that happened after that is considered as modern JavaScript because a lot of things changed in the language. Lots of things were added, and that's what we're going to cover in this talk. So if you are following online, you can ask questions in the chat. I'll be taking a look at the chat from time to time, see if we have any questions popping up in here. And in the meeting room, it's even easier. You can ask me anytime. So first things that changed in JavaScript quite a bunch recently is the notion of modules and the notion of variables. So if you've done any sort of JavaScript in the past, you're probably familiar with the fact that to declare a variable, you would have to use the var keyword, right? This has been around in JavaScript forever, but now the idea is to actually stop using it or have other options available that usually make more sense. So these two options are let and const. When you use let, it's going to declare a variable just like you would do with var, with the exception that the scope of the variable makes a lot more sense. Because the scope of that variable is going to be the nearest enclosing block. What does that mean? It means if I declare the variable inside the if block, then the scope of the variable is that if block and nothing else. If it is inside a function, the scope is the function. If it's inside any sort of block, basically in between curly braces, that's the scope of the variable. Whereas var in the past was different. Var would always scope to the nearest enclosing function, which means if you didn't have any function, then var was just a global variable that would apply everywhere. And even if you declared something with var inside the if block, then it would be accessible outside of that block. So the scope with var was really weird and specific to JavaScript. Let basically behaves like most other languages. So if you're familiar with any other language, let works the same. And that's why it's a better idea usually to use let. And we also have const, which is just like let, but it's a constant. So once you use const, you cannot reassign a value to that variable. So let's give this an example. What I'm going to do is share my entire screen so you can see when I switch from one tab to the other. And so I'm going to go in Google Chrome. And if you want, you can do that on your own as well. You can go to Google Chrome, open a tab, doesn't have to display any website or anything. And in here, you can open the DevTools by doing a right click and inspect. For instance, this would open the Chrome DevTools to the right, in which you can go to the console tab. And in that console tab, the idea is we can play with JavaScript. It's basically a playground, a sandbox where we can do things. So for instance, I can declare a variable a equals 2 in here. Enter, and now that variable is defined. If I want to check its value, I type a, return, and there we go, it says 2. So it's an easy way to practice with JavaScript, test things out. And as I show things during this talk, feel free to just do the same and practice in that console to test the different things that I'm talking about. So the one thing we could test is the fact that when we use const, we get a constant. So I'm going to call it constant, and I'm going to assign some. Now, I made a typo in here. Go. So that constant is now defined, and it has a value, and try to assign something else. So constant in equals 21. This is going to throw an error now. And it's telling me that I cannot do that because it's a constant, so I cannot reassign a value to it. So that's one of the new things that we have in JavaScript. Didn't exist before, and this was added with ES6 or ES 2015, which was a version of JavaScript that happened 6 years ago. So on top of that, they added the notion of module in JavaScript, which basically allows us to share code between multiple files. Because before, you would have to use different scripts on your HTML page and import them one by one, and basically hope that all of the different scripts are loaded when you're trying to use a variable from another script. With this notion of module, you can create, you can export code from one file using the export command. So you can export a function, a variable, a class, anything you want, and import it on in another file. So for instance, if we create a bunch of constants like this in a file, we can export them using the following syntax. So export const x equals 10, or export x and first name. This would export 2 of them. Or we can export them with a different name. So x would be exported as foo, first name would be exported as bar, which I don't recommend because that's usually confusing. The syntax that I see used most often, and that is the easiest to understand, I believe, is the first one, because as soon as you declare something, you're making it as explicit that it is exported, and as a result, it is meant to be public in a sense that other files in your code are going to be able to see that declaration. So that's the main purpose of export. And then once you have exported stuff, it can be imported in other files. So you would import one or more things from a specific file. So here we import name1, name2 from foo, which assumes that we have a file somewhere called foo in which we have name1 and name2 that are exported. If that's not the case, then JavaScript would throw an error and say, I cannot do that. When you import, you can also do some renaming, which here can be helpful sometimes. Sometimes if you're using 2 different libraries, let's say 2 different calendar libraries, and they both have a calendar object or something like that, you might want to rename at least one of those when you import, so that you know which one comes from where. And so that's how you would do it. Here we import name1, but it is going to be known as bar in that file. And you can also import everything from a specific file. So import star as bar from foo. This would import everything that is exported in foo, and it would have the bar prefix because we imported star as bar. So everything from foo would be prefixed with bar dot. Which is a little bit more surprising, but yeah, it works. Just a way to avoid listing. If you have to import 50 different things, for instance, instead of having 50 imports, this would do everything at once. And there is a final one, which import foo. So this one is just going to run the code in that file and not really import any definition in it. So just a way to, if you have a script that you want to run, that does some initialization or something, that's one way to make it happen. So that's a notion of exports and import. Usually, if you're working on JavaScript with some sort of IDE, the IDE would take care of that for you, exporting, importing, getting the path right, and everything. So yeah, IDEs make our life a little bit easier when it comes to modules. Do we have any questions so far? So I know that modules are not the most interesting part. We're going to get into the interesting things pretty soon. Okay, the chat is quiet. The room is quiet. We're all good. So the next topic I want to get into is strings. So with strings in modern JavaScript, we have the notion of backticks for template strings. And before I talk about that, it might be a good idea to do a quick reminder of how we work with strings in JavaScript. So if I declare a variable str here, and I want to assign a string to it, I can use double quotes like this. Failed. And that would create a string with my first name in it. That's option number one. Option number two would be to use single quotes like this. Same result, just different syntax, but both of them create a new variable with the same string assigned to it. So what's the difference between the two? None. They work the same way. The only thing is, if you have a string in which you would need single quotes, for instance, then I would recommend using double quotes as a delimiter. That way you don't have to escape those strings inside. So that's a benefit. Or if it's the opposite, if you have a string in which you're going to have double quotes, then you can use single quotes as a delimiter, right? Because we have these options, we can do that. If we want to use double quotes around the string and inside the string, then we would have to escape with a backslash like this, which works, but is very confusing, I think. Not easy to read. So yeah, you can use one or the other depending on your use case. And that was before modern JavaScript. So these two options were available before. They are still available now, but now we have a third option. And that third option is to use backticks. So a backtick looks like this. It's not a single quote, it's slightly different. Usually on your keyboard, it will be in the top left corner next to the number one. That's a backtick. And they work in a similar fashion. They have the same base features. You can create a string like this, and that works. But these backticks, they have some extra powers that are very interesting. For instance, with backticks, you can have a string that's going to span multiple lines. So you can start a string up here, and let's see if I can do that in here. Go to a new line, and a new line, and some more, and then close the backtick down here. And all of that between the opening backtick and the closing backtick is my string. So even if you have new line characters or anything, it's all part of that same string, which is very convenient because it did not exist with the double quotes or the single quotes. So this works, and now you can see that string number 4. If it shows a raw value like this, we have the backslash ends, which are the new lines. And yeah, that's my string with new line characters in it. If I wanted to do something similar in the old world of double quotes or single quotes, I would have to do something like this and append something on a different line. So it would be a lot more work to make it happen, right? With backticks, we save all of that complexity of opening the string, closing it when we want to go to a new line, append with plus, and keep going. So that's a nice simplification here that we get. And another feature that we get with those backticks is that in the middle of those strings, we can now have expressions that get evaluated as a string gets created. So for instance, if I use a string with backticks in here, in the middle of that string, I can now use $curly brace like this. That's an expression. And in that expression, I'm going to pass here another string that's going to be evaluated. So that's passing a parameter inside our string in that expression that's going to get evaluated for us. And so let's run that and display it. And you can see that it works. So this new string 5 took the value of string 2, which is my first name, and put it in here so that the actual value in the end is this. So it's an easy way to make a string a little bit more powerful and be able to inject values into it that get evaluated from expressions. And these expressions can be in JavaScript, meaning I could do something like this, 1 + 2 equals, and in my expression, display 1 + 2, right? We can put any JavaScript in those expressions. And this string number 6 would be, maybe a typo here again. This 6 is 1 + 2 = 3. So that's something pretty powerful, and it to JavaScript, because JavaScript these days is used a lot to create HTML in a dynamic way. So we want to be able to pass custom content, strings and HTML code on the fly. So using template strings like this is very convenient.
So these syntax work with TypeScript?
Yeah, so everything I'm talking about here is JavaScript only. And if you use something like Angular, for instance, you're probably, which also works with React, by the way, which is a layer on top of all of that. So everything you have in TypeScript, well, not everything you have in TypeScript, but everything you have in JavaScript, you also have it in TypeScript. These work in both JavaScript and TypeScript, yes. So that's what we have, new things in strings. Yeah, I could also have displayed a new date in my string. I can show that to you. Let's clear all of this. I create a new variable today, and today is $curly brace, and here I create a new date object inside that expression. Then I close my backtick. So this would create a new string in which you can see that a new date was inserted. It's verbose, but it's everything. So yeah, it can be pretty powerful and interesting. Okay, I don't see any questions here. So I'll move on to one of the parts that has changed the most, I would say, in JavaScript, that has evolved quite a lot. And that can confuse even people with experience. So people who've been doing JavaScript forever, they can get confused by all of these new things we have available in functions in JavaScript. So if you've done any sort of JavaScript, you've probably stumbled upon functions like this one here. So this is a function declaration. We give it a name. We specify if there are any arguments. So this one has up to 3 arguments. Then we have the function body that starts here, ends here, and we can return a value from that function. So basic syntax. That's how you create a function in JavaScript. Now, that syntax, there's one thing to be aware of. The arguments that you pass here, they can be accessed like this. So arg1, arg2, arg3, these are going to be local variables inside the function. But there is also a magic variable called arguments, which can be accessed in here. And that arguments variable is actually an array that contains all of these three arguments. So the first element in the arguments array is triple equals to argument 1. And the second element is argument 2, third is argument 3. So if you want to iterate through your arguments with a loop, for instance, that's convenient because it's an array. So it's easy to do a for loop to iterate over that. I've never used it, but it's out there. It's one of these interesting things that JavaScript has kind of hidden and that people don't use a lot, but it's part of the language. So next thing I want to talk about in functions is the notion of REST parameters. So when we create a function in JavaScript, one of the things that is different from other languages is that JavaScript does not care about your function or method signatures. Even if I say that I'm expecting 1, 2, 3 arguments, I could actually call that function with 1, 2, 3, 0, 10, doesn't matter. JavaScript is just gonna do it. If I code it with 0 arguments, then these 3 guys are going to be undefined. If I code it with 10 arguments, it's just going to use arg1, 2, 3, and the other ones are just going to be ignored. So there's no runtime error, nothing wrong. It's just going to work with what we define in here. And if we pass more or less, then it's going to ignore what's missing. So one way to kind of help a little bit with that and allow us to manage the fact that the number of arguments is dynamic is this notion of REST parameters, where now when we create a function, we can use the following signature, where we say the first parameter is going to be A, the second parameter is going to be B, and everything else, any other parameter that we pass, now they get added to an array that is going to be known as C. So the rest of the parameters go into that array automatically, which means that if I call that function with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then can you guess what's going to happen? A is going to be 1, B is going to be 2, and C is an array with 3 elements into it, 3, 4, and 5. So that way it makes it slightly easier to work with functions that have a variable number of arguments. And it basically makes it explicit in a signature that here we expect something that can have as many things as we want. It's not enforced in terms of size or anything, but at least we make it explicit in a signature that it's going to be a bunch of things. Any questions on that? I don't see any questions in the chat. All is good. So we see that these 3 dots here are going to be used in quite a few different ways in JavaScript. That's just one of them. And then we'll see a few later. Another nice thing that we have with functions now in JavaScript is that we can provide default values. So when I create a function signature, I can specify default values for everything. So here my function add takes 2 parameters, x and y, and I can define that if we don't pass anything for the first value, then it's going to be 1. and the second value would be 2 if we don't pass anything to it. So example for this one, I'm gonna create a function here. I'm gonna call it add. Takes 2 parameters, so x equals 1, y equals 5, just to be slightly different from the example there. And we're gonna return x plus y. So now, according to that function signature, what happens if I do add 2 and 3? What is this going to return? 5, right? We're passing 2 parameters. So x and y becomes 2 and 3. We return the sum of these two, so that's 5. Now, what if I do something like this? 6, 2, 4. What are we going to get? 8. Does everybody agree with that? No? Yes? Hence, that's 8. Because x becomes 6, y becomes 2, and 4 is ignored because it's not part of our signature, so it just doesn't matter. So just to illustrate that JavaScript doesn't care about function signatures. If you pass more stuff, it's just going to ignore it. What if we pass less? If I do add 2, what is this going to return? 7. Yes. Because x is going to be 2, y is going to be 5. It's going to use a default value. And that makes 7. Now let's try to get tricky here. If I do add 2 and null, is this going to be using the default or not? It is not. But it's going to do 2 plus null, which is 2. If I do 2 and undefined, that's 7. So that's something to be aware of in JavaScript. In JavaScript, undefined means we didn't assign anything. It's empty, really. It's nothing. Null, on the other end, is slightly different. It's still empty, but it's intentional, meaning we are saying this is empty. It's not something that we forgot to pass. We really want this to be empty. And that's the key distinction between the two. Undefined is, yeah, just something that didn't get any value assigned, whereas null is assigned to a variable, right? So null acts as something, whereas undefined is really nothing in that case. And so the default value is going to apply. And it just happens that 2 plus null in JavaScript is 2, which is kind of weird, but yeah. Behaves like 0, basically. Any questions on that? Let's see if we have anything in the chat. Looks like we're good. So I'm going to move on to the next big thing, and that's a part that can get confusing, even to people who have more experience with JavaScript. That's the notion of arrow functions. So the idea with arrow functions was to have a shorter syntax for our JavaScript functions. So instead of using the function keyword, we could start directly with the parenthesis, the list of arguments, then the arrow symbol like this, so equals, greater than, and then the function definition. So it's just a way to have shorter function definitions, which means that if we had a function like this one initially, function that takes x and y and returns x plus y, we could simplify it in the following fashion using the arrow function syntax, where we remove the function keyword and we use the arrow instead. And that does the same thing. Now there's even one more simplification that we can do. If our function, all it does is return a value, if the only instruction inside the function body is a return statement, we can even simplify our arrow function even further and do what we have down here, x, y, arrow, x plus y. This is equivalent to what we have up here. So the idea is just to write as fewer characters as possible. And it works. So let's take a quick look at that. I go here. I'm going to create a new function, add. It's going to take x, y, and return x plus y, like that. I already declared something called add. So let's call it add function. Now, if I call add function to 8, that becomes 10. So that's a nice and easy way to create functions with most of the time one line of code instead of 3, which basically would be the minimum otherwise. Now, because the goal is to write little to no code, in terms of syntax, what they decided to do is that if the function takes only one argument, you can even remove the parentheses from the signature. So the arrow function just becomes the parameter arrow and what you do with that parameter. So no need for the parentheses around the parameter, around the argument, if it's only one. And that's the only exception, because if there's no argument, then you do need the parentheses to indicate that it doesn't take anything as a parameter. So just to create a little bit of confusion. Now, that said, you could be using the parentheses even when you have one argument. It's not required to remove them. It's up to you. You can have them or remove. Things should work the same way. So here's a good example here. A row function that returns new date.getTime. I'm going to use that one as an example. So I go back to my console here. I'm going to create a today. I'm going to reassign something to today. It's going to be that function that returns new date.getTime. And now when I call that function today, it returns the timestamp for right now. Maybe let's just make it new date. And dot to locals date string, for instance. That's cleaner. And I call it again, and there we go, 11/13/2021. So you can create utility functions like this pretty easily. And yeah, it's easier to call today than to local date string, basically. So you can create shortcuts using this nice and tiny to a variable, and there you go. So that's function in a nutshell. Any questions on that? Does it all make sense? So next topic I want to talk about is the notion of destructuring, which pretty basic, but it can lead to here in your code. So the destructuring is you have an object that might have several different properties, and you just need, let's say, 1, 2, or 3 of these properties. So you just want to extract stuff from one object. And that's what destructuring is all about. Destructuring is going to help you take some values from an object and have those values assigned to other variables. So say we have an object like this one here, person, that has a first name and a last name. If I want to extract those two last name in their own variables, I can do the following. Const first name equals person. And that way, first name is going to be equal to Jane, is going to be equal to Doe. So you can apply this to as many as you want. Just 1, 2, 3, 4, doesn't matter. So just to illustrate this, let's refresh all of that, clear my scope. Object here, like this one, for instance. I create an object with 2 different properties, B and C. And if I wanted to get the value of B from that object, I could do the following. Let B equals A. Now B is equal to 24. So it does seem easy, but it can be a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with that syntax. And where it is possible to create even more confusion is with the following syntax, where when you do your destructuring, you can decide to rename the variable. And so here, first name would become given name, and last name would become surname. So now we are declaring 2 new variables, given name and surname, that have the values of respectively first name and last name. So that can be confusing if I start doing something like this. Because now we have both B and C in here, but I'm extracting the value of B as C from A. So C would be equal to 24 in that case. That doesn't change whatever we have in A. Right. C is still 45 as a property of A. So yeah, the renaming part, I think, can be pretty confusing, especially if you do TypeScript, where in TypeScript, the column like this is used to specify the type. So that makes it even more weird because now it's like, what am I doing? Am I renaming or providing type info or Yeah, plus it's the same syntax as when we declare the object, right? So yeah, this one I'm not a fan. They should have found another way to do it. Maybe an arrow. I don't know. Something different. So that's destructuring. And this also applies to functions. So if you're using React, I know that in the React world, people use that a lot. Probably too much, makes it a little bit confusing for beginners, where the destructuring happens in the function argument declaration. So what this means is that the function create box down here takes as a parameter any object that has a color, a width, and a height property. So the nice thing about this is you can specify what the objects, what the expected object looks like. It should have these 3 different properties as part of the object, and it can have more. It could have more properties than this, but the only ones we care about are these 3. And yeah, what can be confusing is that it's using the curly braces, just like in the function body. So someone new to this could think, wait, where is my function? Is it this? Is it that? This is a function body. These are the arguments using destructuring. So if I take that example here, let's say I go here, I'm gonna copy this, and I'm just gonna return string. But I'm going to combine a few things that we learned today. So I'm going to use a template string, and I'm going to say color is the color. And to make it different, dimensions are we don't even need the return here because it's a one-liner. So that's a function create box that takes one object as a parameter. This object has to have, well, it doesn't have to, but we expect, we would like to get a color, a width, and a height as a parameter on that object. And it's going to return a string using those 3 different things. So now if I create the specs for my box, that would be an object. I would specify the color. The color is going to be blue. Width 10, height 45. And now I can call create a box using that box spec as a parameter. And there we go. Let's return the string. Color is blue. Dimensions are 10 by 45. So you see that I have to pass an object that has these 3 properties. If I pass a subset, we pass an object that happens to have less. Let's say we only pass color, for instance. What did I do here? Color would be red. The dimensions are undefined by undefined, because width and height are undefined in that case. So always the same thing with JavaScript, being super flexible, not throwing any errors, but yeah, using undefined if we don't pass anything. So that's destructuring in a nutshell. And yeah, again, if you learn React, mostly they use that all the time. That sort of syntax is going to be all over the place. Along with the next one here that I'm going to talk about, which is spreading. So spreading is going to use the same ... syntax as the one that we saw earlier. So it's an easy way to clone an object or to merge multiple objects into one. So here we create an object, object1, that has 2 properties. I create object2, and object2 is going to be a new object in which we spread all of the properties of object1. So that's what the 3 dots mean in that context. It really means takes everything from object1 and put it in here. So let's give this a try. Going to the whiteboard here, object. I'm going to create a copy of it. Dot, dot, dot. Object 1. Now my object 2 looks like this. It's a copy of object 1. Now, the nice thing about that syntax is that it can be combined with other stuff. I could do something like this, for instance. Create a new object where I have a property C with the following value, and then we spread object 1 in here. So this is going to create another object that has 3 properties, A, B, and C. And I could also, just to illustrate something different, I could decide to make a copy of object 1 and override values from it. Now object 4 is going to be everything from object 1, which would be A, apple, B, banana. But then we're going to is A, my apple. So what are we going to end up with? Do we have 2 properties A? Not possible. So we're going to end up with just one, is my apple. So the way to read this is from left to right, basically. First, we spread one, and then we add or override a property A with the value my apple. If I put that before, then the value of A would still be apple. So the order matters and allows us to do whatever we want in the end. So if you want to provide a default value to make sure that we get something, we could do that. And then this could override or not, depending on what's in that object, or the other way around. We say we want everything on that, but for this property, we want our own thing in here. So yeah, this could be pretty powerful, allow us to do quite a few nice things. And yeah, you can apply it multiple times as well. In my examples, I use it once, but here it's another one where we have object 1, object 2, and we create object 3, which is a merge of these 2. And the same rule applies. It goes from left to right. So first we would add object 1. So that would be A, apple, B, banana. And then object 2, which would add C, cat, and B, dog is going to override the B equals banana from object 1. So we end up with ABC, A, apple, B, dog, C, cat. And if we do it in the other direction, first object 2, then object 1, then B would be banana in the end. So these, the spread operator that we saw on objects, it also works with arrays. So you can create an array of things and then create a copy of that array. So same thing, just using the square brackets instead of the curly braces, and you get the same behavior. Also a way to merge multiple arrays into one. So names, more names, and then all names is names, and then more names. So we concatenate these 2 arrays into just one, which is a nice and easy way to do it. And this syntax down here, also something very widely used in React, is destructuring of an array, just like we saw the destructuring of objects. So here we have a full name variable, which is an object with 2 values in it. We use destructuring, so const array first name, last name equals. So with an object, we would pass the name of the properties that we want to destructure. With an array, it's just the orders that matters. So the first element gets assigned to first name, the second element gets assigned to last name. It works by index in that case. We can also do the renaming. No renaming in here, doesn't make sense. But we can do some complex stuff. So do an array with 1, 2, 3, 4. So what would we get if I do this? A equals 1, right? What about I'm getting tricky. Does this even work?
Yeah, it worked. ARR2 is undefined, right?
So you think it will be undefined? Let's see. So B is 1, that makes sense. And ARR2 is actually everything else in the array.
Okay.
So the rest syntax applies here.
I see.
So it's a way to say everything but the first element. Which, by the way, also works, I believe, with the following syntax. Now it's confusing, isn't it? So that would be everything but the first element. And we don't assign it to anything, so just empty, comma, ... array 3. That works. Want to make it even more confusing, you can apply the same idea multiple times. So get everything but the first, second, and third value into array 3, which would have to be array 4 in that case. I lost it. Yeah, that's the idea. Array 4 should be just 4 in that case. Can we do it in the other direction? So let's say everything but last one. Just has to be the last thing. But I could see some use cases for that. So hopefully one day. Any questions on these examples here? Did you learn new stuff?
Oh yeah.
Good. Yeah, sometimes even me, I learn stuff when I do this because people ask questions, we test it, and it's like, oh wow, that works, that's good. Like these ones here, these sort of tricks, I think I learned them by just trying out during sessions like this. So. So next thing I want to talk about is the notion of class in modern JavaScript. So that's also something entirely new to the language, at least new in 2015. you can define a class now in JavaScript, and that class can have public properties. So here, height and width, which in that case we initialize in the constructor. So the constructor takes two parameters, and we assign these two public properties of rectangle as we create an instance of that class. So in order to create a rectangle, we would have to do new rectangle and pass the two parameters to the constructor. So let's give this a try. If I take that definition, copy it, and paste it in my console here. Now I can create a rectangle using the new rectangle and height 10, width 45. It's created a rectangle object. Rect.width, that's 45. Dot height, that would be 10. I created an object from that class. It's of type rectangle and it has two different properties. Height would be 0 by default if we don't pass anything, and width would be undefined. So we can have default values, which also apply to the constructor parameters. We could have defaults in here as well. We can make those properties private, and this is one of the very latest things that were added to JavaScript. I think it was ES 2020 or even ES 2021. Well, that's this year or last year maximum. Using the hashtag as a prefix makes those properties private. And that's a weird syntax. There's been a lot of debate on whether it should be like this or not, and decided to go with the hashtag prefix to make things private. Let's see if I can use that definition here. Yeah, looks like it works. So if I create my rectangle just like before, now if I try to get the width, it's just going to say undefined because it's private, so we cannot see it. So we would only be able to access these values from within the class itself. This should also, yeah, it's saying, hey, you're trying to read it, but you're not allowed, so error.
So the default scope is private.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the scope of these two is they're private now. Which means we cannot do anything with them outside of the class. So that's very, very new. I'm not even sure if it's supported everywhere at this point, which allows me to show you another trick. So can I use.com? That's a very good website where you can test all things JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. So here, can I use private class fields? And the answer is, yeah, with most browsers, you should be fine. Internet Explorer is gone, so not surprising that it's not going to support it, but Edge, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, pretty much everything is going to support that at this point. Also works with methods. So yeah, it gives you the percentage of support across all browsers according to what people use these days on the web. So this gives you 89.5% of support across all browsers worldwide. This one is 78, so slightly less, which is surprising because the list seems to be exactly the same as above. I see the same browser versions, unless here. Opera 6280, this one is 7080. Yeah, so it's a little bit for the methods. And so the other nice thing about that website is not only it's going to tell you if that feature is already supported by all the browsers, it also gives you access for that feature. So private class methods, for instance, I don't have it in my slides. The syntax for those, I can click here, and it's going to tell me how it works, which is basically using the hashtag in front of the method name inside the class. Also works with static properties. In private, does that even make sense? Not much. Okay. So that's classes. There's getters and setters with the following syntax. So get foo or set foo, which would allow you to get or set a value. When you do obj.foo, it calls a getter. And if you do obj.foo equals something, then it calls a set method above. So it's just a way to have getter and setter would be invoked even when we use the following syntax, which doesn't look like you're using a getter and setter. So I'm not a huge fan of this one, but it's available. We can use it.
What is the use of defining the get and set methods if we can access it like object.foo?
Well, the thing is, you don't. When you do that, it is calling the get.
Okay, but if I don't define it, does it implicitly define it? Like,
well, if it's not defined, it would return undefined. But if you assign a new value, so if you do obj.foo equals bar, it would create a new property foo on that object.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's not extremely helpful. I see it as more dangerous than anything else, because you could create a bug by having a getter that doesn't return the actual value, or the setter that sets something else than what you're expecting. So yeah, I never use those. They're out there, but yeah. And finally, the notion of inheritance in JavaScript. So now that we have classes, we can have object-oriented features. So you can have a class that extends another class, which means that you can call, you must call, in that case, the constructor of the superclass with super, and you can call method from the superclass as well, super.method name. And JavaScript only supports single inheritance. So you can extend one class, not 2, 3, 4. Let's see if we have any questions. Yeah, I see a good point in the chat. The get and set could be great for debugging. You can set a breakpoint in that. Yeah, that's true. We can't redo that otherwise. If we had regular properties with no getter and setter, then it's a little bit more tricky to. So yeah, that's one plus.
Good one.
So the next thing, and this one is probably the most widely used of all of the things we have mentioned, is the notion of promises. So promises, I think the first time they appeared in any sort of JavaScript, it was with AngularJS. AngularJS had this notion of promises that was done via an external library. And with ES 2015, promises became part of JavaScript itself. So that's a concept that it's usually a little bit more tricky to understand if you've never heard about that before, because the idea with a promise is that it is used to run an asynchronous task. So a task that's going to take some time, and usually 99% of the time, the use case for a promise is to make an HTTP request. So you want to make a request to a server to get some data. It's going to take a few milliseconds, seconds, worst case scenario. And the thing in JavaScript is that you cannot block the JavaScript engine. And JavaScript is not multi-threaded. It's one process. So if your do something takes 5 seconds, then the entire browser would be waiting for 5 seconds. So instead of that, we have this notion of promise where we can do something asynchronously. So run a task that's going to be happening in the background without blocking anything. And when the task completes, then we do something. So the then method is what's going to allow us to register a function, a callback, one for success, one for failure. And those are going to be called upon success or upon failure of that task. That way, if the task do something takes 10 seconds, nothing is blocked. Our application, our web browser keeps running just like it should. And after the 10 seconds, if the task was successful, the success callback is called with any data returned from that task. So it's really a way to delegate a task, put it on the back burner, and once it completes, we get notified and we can work with the data. And the main thing to be aware of is that to make that happen, we have the then method that's going to allow us to register these callbacks. So here we have an example. We create a promise. When we create a promise, we pass a function to the constructor. And that function takes 2 params, resolve and reject. Resolve is a function that we call when we want to return the result of the task. Reject is what we call if we want to throw an error and not complete. So that promise here is just a way to simulate a task that would return after 2 seconds. So we use a JavaScript set timeout to delay that we're going to resolve with the data. That's going to be the following string after 2 seconds. So that's the promise definition. And down here, we subscribe to it. We pass a success callback. And on success, we just log the result to the console. So let's say I'm going to take this one and make it 12 seconds, just so I have time to subscribe to it. I'll take all of that code, copy it, and paste it in here so that we get a promise. We subscribe to it. There we go. It's pending. And after 12 seconds, we should see something happening in my console. It's a lot of time. There we go. So after 12 seconds, we got data and the value returned from the promise. So what we resolve here is the data that we receive in the callback down there. And in our case, we just log it to the console. And as you could see, this was not blocking my code in any way. My terminal was not blocked. I could still be doing things, typing, clicking around. All of that was happening in the background. And then when the data gets there, the function gets invoked. So now it's native to the browser. As you can see, I can do new promise right there in JavaScript, and it works. No need for an external library to do that anymore.
But if you want want to do a synchronous processing, then you have to nest each promise into.
Oh, yeah, that's
It's
one of
should
my
be nested.
that's one on my next slides. So I'll get to that pretty soon. So along with that notion of promise, we have a bunch of utilities, I would say, that are also native to JavaScript now. Promise.all. So if you have multiple different tasks that you have to run, and you want to do something once they all complete, once you have the result from all of them, you can do that using promise.all, pass an array of promises, so an array of tasks that are going to take some time, and then do something when you get a result. The result in that case is going to be an array of all of the values that you receive from each promise. So what gets returned by promise 1 would be the first value in the array. What gets returned by promise 2 is the second value, and this one is the third. So in the same order as you pass those promises to the array. So a concrete example for that would be you're doing some sort of search feature in an app, and you want to call 3 different services, 3 different backends. Like you want to do a search on Google and Yahoo and Bing. So you make 3 different requests, and once you get a result from these 3 requests, you want to display them. That would be one way to do it using promise.all. When we get into that function, you know that you have the 3 results from the 3 different requests, no matter the order in which they resolved. So even if the third one was the fastest, the value is still the third in that array. So it makes it easier to deal with multiple things that happen in parallel, and that can take some amount of time that we don't know upfront. And on a similar topic, we have race, which is the opposite, sort of the opposite of all, because race is not going to wait for everything, every single promise to complete. It's just going to wait for one of them to complete. So here we have a race between 2 different promises. This one resolves after 100 milliseconds, this one after 500. So the second one is going to win. So the output should be 2. So that would be, you have a front-end website requesting data from a bunch of different servers that you have available. You want the fastest result. So you do promise.race, and whoever returns first wins. Easy enough. So the good thing is it's 1 line of code in the end to make that race happen. So pretty nice and easy. And the last thing is async await. So async await are it's a JavaScript syntax that is supposed to simplify our code. Now I say supposed because sometimes it ends up making things more complex, in the sense that people tend to abuse await way too much, and tend to think that it makes things synchronous, or they tend to make things kind of like they're synchronous, even if it doesn't make sense to do so, I would say. So what does await do? Await is the equivalent of doing promise.then and passing a callback to it. In that callback, we would assign the value that we get to result in that case. So it's just a shortcut for the following. Yes, but then data result. So this can be turned into just that, with the benefit that the code that we have after on the next line would really happen once this completes, which would not be the case if we did a promise.then, or we would have to put the alert result inside that callback as well. So to simplify the nesting of things that can help. With the downside that sometimes people are going to do something, wait for it, do something, wait for it, do something, wait for it, and then things get slower because they make request after request after request, then when they could actually do all of that in parallel many times. So that's why personally, I'm not a huge fan of async wait, because it can have unexpected side effects, I would say. But it does make things a little bit easier to read. So it doesn't make the code synchronous, even if it does look like it. Because we could think that our app, our JavaScript is going to stop here, wait for this to happen, and then do that. That's kind of the case, but not really. It's just as if we were putting that in a callback that happens once we get the data. So yeah. So promises are complex, and yeah, it usually takes a little bit of time to get used to them. So if you never heard about that before, this part was probably confusing, and it's normal. That makes sense. So that's modern JavaScript, and there's actually a lot more to it. I listed a few more things that are now available in JavaScript. Storage, for instance, so you can use local storage, session storage to store data in the browser and decide how long it's going to stay there, the duration of the user session, or forever, basically. There is new tools for internationalization in JavaScript. So functions that help translate different date formats, getting the locale of the browser, setting the plural rules to, pluralize strings, number formats, all of these sort of things are getting now natively added to JavaScript little by little to help translate websites. Keyed collections, we talked about arrays quite a bunch. Now we also have maps, hash maps, and all sort of things as part of JavaScript, maps, sets, weak map, weak set. So it's starting to look a lot more like what you would have in Java, C#, .NET, really adding all of these features that other languages have into JavaScript. I added WebAssembly here, even if WebAssembly is a completely different monster of its own. WebAssembly can allow you to run any sort of code in a browser. So C++ stuff that you would get compiled and displayed in a browser. So even if they have JavaScript APIs to kind of interact with whatever you would have in WebAssembly, yeah, that's a completely different world that allows you to do 3D video games and such. So that's something pretty big. And many more APIs. And that's probably one of the lesser known features of modern JavaScript that is evolving all the time. There's now so many things that we have access to natively in the browser that basically we don't even know about. You can do Bluetooth in the browser now. So you can use your web browser to do a Bluetooth connection to some other device. You can have access to the battery API to check if there is enough battery, or display a warning to the user, hey, your battery is low, something like that. Talked about storage, sensors API. So that's the same idea, kind of as Bluetooth. It's really a way to make our browser smarter when it works on a mobile phone and accessing the sensors. So, GPS, accelerometer, altitude, whatever your mobile phone might have. Now, all of these things are getting into JavaScript so that you could possibly build apps that that are all HTML and JavaScript and still work like a native app on a phone or tablet. And many more. Video, there's a lot of stuff with video now. Media that you can do to control videos. CSS and JavaScript, same thing, lots of powerful stuff. You can do a basic image editor in JavaScript super easily. I did one of those things for VSP a long time ago. Did an app where you could turn an image into black and white or revert the colors or these sort of things. And it was just using some CSS. You just apply a CSS property to the image and boom, you have a basic edition that seems super powerful, but it's just one line of code. So yeah, all of these things are basically the browser is becoming more and more powerful. That's the main idea. If there's just one thing to remember from this talk is that people used to be building Android apps or Apple iPhone apps because they thought I cannot do that on the web. That's not true anymore. You can do pretty much anything you want on the web. There's lots of APIs, lots of features in JavaScript that you can use to get the same stuff. See, touch events even to see what the user is doing with their finger on the screen. So that's really the key here. I added a link with all of these different APIs. Just so you have the full list. And in general, this website, developer.mozilla.org, that's the place that's the most up to date with all things web related. So JavaScript, HTML, CSS, that's where Google and Mozilla and Apple and Microsoft, they go to get the info, update it. You can kind of see it as a Wikipedia of web development in a way. It's really good. So yeah, just to show it, I took a screenshot of the top of the page, but there's a ton more APIs, drag and drop, geolocation, gamepad API, first time I see this one, screen capture API, push API, events, full screen, file system access, that's a new one too, a newer one at least, past couple of years, WebSockets, so much stuff. JavaScript is becoming a platform of its own, really. That was my last slide. Any questions, anyone? Anything else you want to add? Yeah.
For fallacies, we saw when we're fetching an API, we still have to use the JSON method, right, to get the data before we use that, we have to use the JSON method to change the applicant, right?
So if you're using HTTP request,
Yeah.
say something like fetch, for instance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the fetch function, which by the way is also one of the things that modern JavaScript has. I didn't mention it here, but fetch is native to the browser. If you do fetch here, you can make an HTTP request to anything you want. I could fetch google.com right there. And then that would give me a promise. So I would do then, and that would return some data. The data by default would be the full HTTP response with, HTTP status code, all of that. So what you were talking about is the JSON thing, which allows us to turn that data to JSON, which will not work with google.com, by the way. I would have to use text most likely to get the HTML out of it. And then I would be able to console log that, I believe. And it's almost working. Only thing it wants HTTPS. Pending for a while. Maybe my data text failed. No, there it is. That's the page. So yeah, with fetch, you can make an HTTP request, get a promise, and yeah, I was able to request google.com from JavaScript with one line, a long one, but one line of code still. All of that without any external library. So yeah, pretty powerful. Let's see if we have any questions in the chat. I don't see anything. So I think we can close here for today. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for coming on a Saturday afternoon, or maybe even later if any of you are on the East Coast or in another time zone. For those people online, we do have a lot of food in our room here and not many people, so we're going to have a feast now. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Hope you enjoyed the session, and yeah, we'll be organizing more meetups in the future, so feel free to subscribe to our group and attend our sessions next year. Thanks again, and see you soon.